The rain had been falling on Perthshire for 6 days when Daisy Bentley heard the sound that would change everything. She stood at her cottage window, flour dusting her black morning dress, watching the River Tay rage past with a fury she'd never seen in her 23 years. The water had swollen beyond recognition, transforming from the gentle companion of her childhood into a roaring beast that devoured everything in its path. Broken furniture tumbled through the brown torrent, a child's chair, the remnants of someone's supper table, an entire chicken coop with its wire bent and twisted. Uprooted trees spun like dancers in their final performance. It was October 1849, and the world seemed determined to wash itself clean. Daisy pressed her palm against the cold glass. She'd been mixing dough for bread. A widow's work never ceased, even when the sky opened and the earth turned to mud. But her hands had stilled at the window, transfixed by the violence outside. The river had claimed the low road 2 days ago. Yesterday, it had taken the Hendersons' barn. What would it swallow today? The crack of wood answered her unspoken question. She jerked back from the window, heart hammering. The old stone bridge, the one that had stood for 100 years, that her grandfather had crossed as a boy, was giving way. The ancient structure groaned like a dying animal, its center sagging, stones tumbling into the churning water below. And trapped against the collapsing structure was a black carriage. Daisy's breath caught. The vehicle tilted at a sickening angle, one wheel already submerged, the other clawing uselessly at the bridge's crumbling edge. The horses were gone, swept away or drowned, she couldn't tell which. But inside the carriage, cutting through the roar of water and the shriek of breaking timber, came a sound that turned her blood to ice, high-pitched screaming, babies crying. Her body moved before her mind could catch up, feet carrying her toward the door even as fear whispered warnings in her ear. She was a widow, alone, with no help for miles. The nearest neighbor was 3 miles down the valley road, if that road still existed. The water was deadly. The bridge was collapsing, but the babies were screaming. Daisy tore open her door and ran. The cold hit her like knives when she entered the water. It seized her chest, squeezed her lungs, dragged at her legs with hungry fingers. The current was impossibly strong, trying to sweep her downstream, away from the carriage, away from those desperate cries. She fought it step by agonizing step, her widow's blacks becoming a sodden weight that wanted to pull her under. The water rose to her thighs, her waist. She grabbed at a broken piece of bridge railing, used it to haul herself closer. The carriage groaned, shifted. "Hold on!" she screamed, though she didn't know if anyone inside could hear her over the river's rage. The door was jammed. Daisy wrenched at the handle, her fingers slipping on wet metal, her desperation mounting with each failed attempt. The bridge gave another sickening crack. She had seconds, maybe less. She braced her foot against the carriage wheel and pulled with every ounce of strength her body possessed. The door burst open so suddenly she nearly fell backward into the current. Inside, strapped to the seat in a wicker basket, were 2 infants, 8 months old perhaps, soaked through, their faces red from crying, but alive, terrified, beautiful. And beside them, slumped against the opposite door, was a man. Blood trickled from a wound on his temple. His eyes were closed, his fine clothes ruined by river water and mud. Daisy's decision was made in a heartbeat. She grabbed the basket, pressed it to her chest, and turned back toward shore. The baby's screams intensified as she wrenched them from their precarious shelter. But she had no time for gentleness. The current seized her immediately, trying to drag all 3 of them downstream. She planted one foot, then another, fighting for inches when miles seemed impossible. Water dragged at her skirts. The weight of the fabric, heavy as iron chains, pulled at her legs. She nearly fell, caught herself on a submerged rock that tore her palm open, kept going. The basket tilted. She clutched it tighter, feeling the babies shift inside, their small bodies helpless against forces they couldn't comprehend. Her foot found purchase on the bank. Then another. She hauled herself forward, muscles screaming, and finally collapsed onto muddy ground 20 feet from the water's edge. She set the basket down with shaking hands, gasping for air that wouldn't come fast enough. The babies were still crying, but it was the most beautiful sound she'd ever heard. Alive. They were alive. But the man wasn't safe yet. Daisy didn't let herself rest, didn't let herself think about what she was doing, about the madness of it, about how the river might claim her this time. She simply turned and stepped back into the water. It was deeper now, waist deep. The carriage was groaning, shifting, seconds from being torn free and swept into oblivion. She grabbed the man by his coat collar, expensive wool, she noted absurdly, and hauled with strength she didn't know she possessed. He was heavy, dead weight. The current tried to help and hinder in equal measure, sometimes pushing him toward her, sometimes trying to rip him from her grasp. Daisy dug her heels into the riverbed and pulled, dragged, inched backward toward shore. Her muscles screamed, her vision blurred. The rain, lighter now but still falling, mixed with tears she didn't remember shedding. One step, another. The man's head lolled against her arm, blood from his wound mixed with river water, staining them both. She reached the bank and collapsed, hauling him clear of the water's reach, just as the carriage tore free behind them. The black vehicle spun once, twice, then vanished around the river bend like it had never existed at all. The driver and horses were already lost, she knew. Some rescues came too late, but not these. Daisy lay on her back in the mud, staring up at the gray October sky, her entire body shaking so violently she thought she might break apart. The rain had eased to a drizzle, as if the heavens themselves were catching their breath after the violence they'd unleashed. She turned her head. The babies were still crying in their basket, tiny fists waving in the air. She forced herself upright and crawled to them, checking with trembling hands for injuries. Miraculously, they seemed unharmed, cold, terrified, but whole. 2 babies, identical in every way except for the small birthmark she noticed behind one infant's ear. Twins. She looked at the man. Even unconscious and battered, his features spoke of refinement, of a life lived far from muddy riverbanks and widows' cottages. His clothes, though ruined, had been expensive once. Quality tailoring, silver buttons. Realization crept over her like cold water. "What have I done?" she whispered. She'd saved them, pulled them from certain death, and in doing so, had tied her fate to theirs in ways she couldn't begin to fathom. This man, these babies, they belonged to a world she'd never touched, a world that would come looking for them. The rain continued its soft patter as Daisy lifted the basket, settled it in the crook of one arm, and began the slow trek back to her cottage. The man would have to make the journey too. Somehow. She'd drag him if she must. She'd already come this far. Behind her, the River Tay roared on, indifferent to the drama played out on its banks. Daisy Bentley had no idea that in pulling them from the river, she had just changed the course of her own fate, and that of a duke. The cottage door slammed behind her with a sound that felt like safety, temporary, fragile, but safety nonetheless. Daisy set the basket down near the hearth and threw fresh wood on the dying fire. Flames roared to life, throwing orange light across the small room as she knelt beside the twins and began stripping away their sodden clothes with shaking hands. The tiny garments were expensive, fine cotton, delicate embroidery, and completely useless now. She dropped them in a wet heap and wrapped both babies in dry cloths from her trunk, pressing their small bodies against her chest to share what little warmth her own shivering frame could offer. They cried with exhaustion, hunger, and terror. The sound tore at something deep in her chest, a place she'd kept carefully walled off since James died. Identical faces stared up at her, mouths open in distress. She could only tell them apart by the small birthmark behind one baby's left ear, a port wine stain no bigger than her thumbnail. Without it, they would have been impossible to distinguish. "Shh," she whispered, though the sound was more for herself than for them. "Shh, you're safe now." But as their cries intensified, her first thought was brutally practical. They need milk. I have no milk. Daisy laid the babies in the wooden box she'd once used for storing potatoes, positioning it close enough to the hearth for warmth, but far enough to be safe. Then she grabbed her shawl and ran back out into the drizzle, across the muddy yard to the barn. The structure still stood, miraculously, though water had seeped under the door and turned the floor to muck. Her goat, stubborn, bad-tempered Bess, stood in the corner, bleating her displeasure at the world's injustices. "You and me both," Daisy muttered, dragging the milking stool close. Her hands shook so violently she could barely grip the teats. The first attempts yielded nothing. She forced herself to breathe, to steady her fingers, to focus on this one simple task. Slowly, the milk began to flow, white streams hitting the wooden pail with a rhythm that steadied her racing heart. Back in the cottage, she warmed the milk over the fire and fed the babies spoonful by spoonful. It was painstaking work. They were too young to drink properly, kept choking and sputtering, milk dribbling down their chins. But gradually, with infinite patience, she got enough into their bellies that their cries softened to whimpers, then to silence. Their eyes drifted closed, small fists uncurling in sleep. The quiet that followed was so profound, it felt like a physical presence. Daisy allowed herself exactly 3 breaths of relief before turning to the man. He lay where she'd left him, sprawled half on the floor near the door, his chest rising and falling in shallow, labored breaths. His skin burned with fever when she touched his forehead. His clothes were still soaked through, clinging to him like a second skin that might kill him if she didn't act quickly. She'd stripped a man's clothes before, her husband's, on the night he'd stumbled home drunk and passed out in the rain. This felt different, more intimate somehow, though she couldn't say why. The coat came off first, fine wool, tailored to fit his frame precisely, with silver buttons and— She paused, squinting in the firelight, a crest partially visible on the inner lining. She didn't recognize it, but its mere presence spoke volumes. The silk shirt beneath was ruined, torn and blood-stained, revealing extensive bruising across his ribs and shoulders. Daisy's hands stilled. These weren't injuries from the river. This violence had been done to him before he went into the water. Someone had beaten him, badly. She continued undressing him with growing unease, cataloging each injury: bruised ribs, split knuckles on his right hand as if he'd fought back, a darkening bruise along his jaw, and the head wound, still bleeding sluggishly despite the cold water's attempt to seal it. Working quickly, she heated water and brandy, cleaned the gash with both. He didn't wake, even when she pressed hard enough that it must have hurt. Threading her needle, She kept her sewing basket well stocked, a widow's necessity. She pulled the skin together with stitches that weren't pretty, but would hold. She'd done the same for James once, after he'd fallen and split his forehead on the woodpile. That had been 2 months before he died. Sometimes she wondered if she should have let him bleed. She pushed the thought away and tied off the thread, then wrapped his head with strips torn from an old sheet. He looked like a casualty of war now, pale and battered but breathing. She covered him with every dry blanket she owned and dragged him closer to the fire, her muscles protesting the effort after the day's earlier exertions. Only then did she examine his hands properly. Calloused but refined. Not a laborer's hands, despite the roughness. The kind of hands that held reins and pens in equal measure, that belonged to a man who worked but didn't have to. His coat's hidden crest, though water-damaged, suggested nobility, or at least significant wealth. The expensive boots, the gold signet ring on his right hand, engraved with initials she couldn't quite make out in the firelight. This was no ordinary traveler. Daisy looked between the sleeping babies and the unconscious man, pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. Someone had tried to kill them, all three of them. The beating, the carriage positioned on the bridge as the flood raged, the driver and horses already lost. It had the feel of something planned, something deliberate. Fear settled into her bones like winter cold. "What if they come here?" she whispered to the empty room. She was alone, a widow for 14 months now, since James had drunk himself into a stupor one December night and never woken up. He'd left her with nothing but debts and this isolated cottage, and a hard-won knowledge that she could survive on her own, that she needed no one, that asking for help only led to disappointment. Now she was responsible for 3 strangers. The bridge was destroyed. There was no way out, no way to get help, even if she'd known where to send for it. The nearest town was Aberfeldy, 10 miles away under normal circumstances. Now, with the roads flooded and the bridge gone, it might as well be 100. They were trapped here together, she and her 3 charges, with potential danger lurking in whatever direction those killers might come from. But looking at the babies, their small faces peaceful now in sleep, their tiny hands curled near their chins, she knew there had been no choice. "I couldn't leave them," she said quietly. "Not now." She rose stiffly, every muscle in her body screaming protest. Taking the old shotgun down from its place above the door, she checked that it was loaded. James had taught her to shoot before the drink took him completely, one of the few useful things he'd ever done. Daisy set the gun beside the chair positioned between the baby's box and the unconscious man. Then she settled into it, pulling her shawl tight around her shoulders. Outside, the rain continued its steady rhythm. Inside, 3 sets of breathing filled the silence, 2 small and even, 1 labored and uncertain. Sleep was impossible. Every creak of the cottage made her jump. Every gust of wind might be footsteps. Every shadow might be someone coming to finish what they'd started. Whoever had tried to kill them might come looking. And when they did, Daisy would be ready. Before we continue, I need to tell you something from my heart. Creating these stories, stories of courage, of impossible choices, of love found in darkness, takes time and care. If this tale is touching your heart, please hit that like button and subscribe. So few do, and it truly helps these stories reach others who need them. Now, back to Daisy and her impossible situation. The groan came in the dead of night, low and rough, dragging Daisy from the half-sleep she'd fallen into. She jerked upright in the chair, heart hammering, hand reaching instinctively for the shotgun. But it wasn't an intruder. The man was conscious, his eyes open and darting around the unfamiliar room with the confusion of someone trying to piece together where they were and how they'd gotten there. He tried to sit up. Failed. Pain twisted his features. "Don't move," Daisy said quietly, setting the gun aside. "You're injured." His gaze snapped to her, focusing with difficulty. Then, in a voice made desperate by fear, "The boys, they're safe, sleeping." She gestured to the box by the hearth where both babies lay curled together, their small chests rising and falling in perfect rhythm. Relief washed over his face with such raw intensity that it couldn't possibly be faked. Whatever else this man might be lying about, his love for those children was real. "Where am I?" he asked after a moment, his voice hoarse. "My cottage. You went into the River Tay 3 days ago. I pulled you out." Silence stretched between them as he processed this, tried to remember. His brow furrowed. She could see him reaching for memories that the fever and head wound had scattered. "Who are you?" "Daisy Bentley. This is my home." She paused, studying him. "Who are you?" The hesitation was too long. Just a heartbeat too long. "Robert. Robert Ashford." Daisy knew it was a lie immediately. 14 months married to a drunkard had taught her what falsehood looked like, the way a man's eyes shifted, the careful arrangement of features into something approximating truth. This man lied differently than James had, with more polish and practice, but it was a lie nonetheless. His accent was Edinburgh refined, upper class. His manner, even wounded and weak, carried the weight of command. And the crest on his coat, water-damaged though it was, matched no Ashford she'd ever heard of. And she'd heard of most, having grown up in service to the gentry before her marriage. But she said nothing. Yet. Within the hour, the fever took him again. This time, it dragged him down into delirium, and with it came fragments of truth spoken to an empty room that Daisy pieced together like a broken puzzle. She sat beside him with her cold cloths and her water, listening to words that weren't meant for her ears. "Edmund. Can't find them. The inheritance. Protect the boys. 4 men on the road. Driver dead before he could shout. Margaret. I'm sorry. Couldn't save you." The picture formed slowly, terribly. An assassination attempt. A dead wife. Margaret, he'd called her. A conspiracy that centered on those 2 sleeping babies and whatever fortune or title they represented. This was far more dangerous than she'd thought. Far more dangerous than she had any right to be involved in. The next 2 days blurred together into an exhausting cycle of survival. The babies cried, needing constant care, milk and warmth and clean cloths, and the kind of patience Daisy hadn't known she possessed. The man burned with fever, thrashing and talking, sometimes fighting her when she tried to change the cold cloths on his forehead or force water between his cracked lips. "Poison," he muttered once, pushing her hand away weakly. "Can't trust—" "I didn't pull you from a river to poison you, you fool," she snapped, pinning his arm down with surprising strength. "Now drink." She learned the baby's rhythms. The one with the birthmark, she'd started thinking of him as Mark in her head for identification, fussed more, cried louder, demanded attention. The other was quieter, more content to simply watch the world with solemn eyes. She was starting to think of them as her boys, which was dangerous. They weren't hers. They could never be hers. But in the dark hours before dawn, when she held them close and felt their small hearts beating against her chest, it was easy to forget. On the third morning, the fever broke. Daisy was feeding the babies when she felt his gaze on her. She'd grown so used to his unconscious presence that the sudden weight of his attention made her hands still, the spoon of warmed milk hovering halfway to Mark's mouth. She turned to find him watching her with an expression she couldn't read. "You're not Robert Ashford," she said flatly. The silence stretched. Then, "No. Who are you really? Does it matter?" Her voice went cold. "When men with weapons might come looking? Yes, it bloody well matters." A ghost of a smile crossed his battered face, there and gone. "Alexander. Alexander Carrington." He paused. "Duke of Gloucester." The room tilted. Daisy set the spoon down carefully, aware that her hands had started shaking. She'd saved a duke. Not just nobility, but one of the highest-ranking peers in the realm. The implications crashed over her like a second flood. He gestured weakly to the babies. "My sons, Edward and Henry." "Someone tried to kill you," she said. Not a question. "My cousin Edmund. If I die without grown heirs, he inherits everything. So he sent assassins to kill you and your children. 4 men. Killed my driver, shot the horses. We went over the embankment into the river." His voice was steady, but she heard the edge beneath it. "I thought we were dead." Daisy looked at the sleeping infants. Edward with his birthmark, Henry without, 6 months old and already marked for murder because of an accident of birth. "Their mother?" she asked quietly. "Dead. Childbirth, 6 months ago." Old grief threaded through his voice like rust. "Margaret." Understanding passed between them in the silence, both widowed, both left to survive in a world that had taken someone they loved. Different circumstances, different lives, but grief was grief, regardless of title or cottage. "The bridge is destroyed," Daisy said finally. "No one's crossing for weeks. So I'm trapped here, with a stranger who deserves to know if assassins are coming to her door." Something like respect flickered in his eyes. "If they come, tell them you saw nothing. You're alone. They'll have no reason to hurt you." "Except I'd be lying." "To save your life." Her arms crossed. "I didn't save you to hand you to murderers. But don't mistake necessity for trust, Your Grace. We survive until you can leave. That's the bargain." He studied her for a long moment, this widow in her rough clothes with flowers still dusting her sleeves and a spine of pure steel running through her. Then he nodded slowly. "Agreed." Outside, the rain had finally stopped. The River Tay still ran high and angry, but the worst of the flood was passing. In a few weeks the water would recede, the bridge could be repaired. Alexander Carrington, Duke of Gloucester, could return to his world, and Daisy could return to her solitude. But neither knew if survival would be enough, or if the men who'd tried once would try again. The week that followed settled into a careful domesticity that felt both strange and necessary. Daisy cared for the babies while Alexander recovered, his strength returning slowly like water seeping back into dry ground. He helped where he could, fetching wood for the fire despite her protests, heating milk, learning to feed Edward and Henry with hands that were too large and clumsy at first. She watched him fumble with the tiny spoon, saw frustration flash across his face when milk dribbled down Edward's chin, noticed the fierce concentration he brought to the simple task of keeping his sons fed. They shared meals with few words. Porridge in the morning, bread and cheese at midday, whatever Daisy could coax from her meager stores in the evening. But they watched each other. Wariness mixed with something else, something neither was willing to examine too closely. Daisy caught herself noticing his laugh when Henry grabbed his finger and wouldn't let go, the way his whole face transformed from the stern lines of command into something younger, almost boyish. Alexander watched her sing to the boys at night, old Scottish lullabies in a voice rough from disuse, and something softened in his expression that made her look away quickly. On the seventh night, Henry woke screaming. It wasn't his normal cry, the demanding wail of a hungry infant, or the protest of a wet cloth. This was high, thin, terrified, animal. Daisy was out of her bed before she was fully conscious, stumbling across the dark cottage to the box by the hearth. She touched Henry's forehead, and her blood turned to ice. Burning. He was burning. Alexander! Not your grace or my lord, just his name, sharp with fear. He was there instantly despite his injuries, moving faster than he should have been able. One look at her face told him everything he needed to know. Fever, Daisy said. Cold terror settled across his features. How long? Just now. Help me. They worked in tandem through the night with the desperate efficiency of soldiers in battle. Cold cloths fetched from the bucket of well water, changed constantly as Henry's body turned them warm. Water coaxed between tiny lips that tried to reject it. Prayers whispered under breath. Daisy's to a god she wasn't sure she believed in anymore. Alexander's to a wife who couldn't hear them. Henry's cries weakened as the hours passed, which was worse than when they'd been loud. A sick silence settled over him, broken only by labored breathing. Edward, sensing his brother's distress with the uncanny awareness of twins, cried too, healthy lungs protesting a danger he couldn't understand. Alexander held Edward, unable to help Henry, his helplessness carved into every line of his body. Daisy saw terror in his eyes, the terror of losing another person he loved, of failing to protect someone who depended on him completely. She'd seen that look once before, in her own mirror, the night James had collapsed, and she'd known there was nothing she could do to save him. The difference was, she'd stopped wanting to save James months before he died. Around midnight, with Henry's breathing shallow, and Edward finally exhausted into sleep, Daisy spoke into the silence. "Tell me about Margaret." Alexander's voice came rough with memory and current fear. "Why?" "Because we need something other than this." She gestured to Henry's small, burning body. "Tell me." He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, she loved music, played the pianoforte badly, and laughed at herself for it. A ghost of a smile. Used to say she had the soul of a musician but the fingers of a blacksmith. Despite everything, Daisy felt her mouth quirk. "Sounds stubborn." "Impossibly." Insisted on visiting the tenants in Gloucester in the middle of winter while pregnant. Said a duchess should know the people she served. His voice cracked slightly. "The midwife said the traveling brought the boys early. Margaret hemorrhaged. 5 doctors couldn't stop it." He paused, his hand gentle on Edward's small back. She held them once, smiled, said they were perfect. His throat worked. Then she was gone. Daisy's own throat tightened. She kept working on Henry, kept changing the cloths, kept checking his breathing. But her voice was softer when she spoke. "My husband died of drink. Not all at once. Slowly." She squeezed water from another cloth, pressed it to Henry's forehead. 2 years watching him choose whiskey over food, over me, over living. Every morning wondering if this would be the day I'd find him dead. Every night grateful he'd made it through another one. She paused, shame coloring her voice. By the end, I was almost relieved when he finally did die. What kind of wife feels relief? The kind who survived something that was killing her too, Alexander said quietly. Their eyes met across the firelight, understanding wordless and complete. They were both survivors of different losses, both carrying guilt that had no right name, both learning to live in the wreckage of what used to be. The night stretched on. They worked in silence now, a comfortable rhythm developing between them. Alexander fetched fresh water. Daisy changed the cloths. He held Henry when she needed to rest her arms. She held Edward when his presence seemed to soothe his brother. They moved around each other like dancers who'd practiced the steps before, anticipating needs, filling gaps. Just before dawn, when the sky outside was turning from black to gray, Daisy felt something shift. She touched Henry's forehead again, held her breath, counted to 10, touched again to be certain. "Cooler," she whispered. "It's breaking." Her voice was unsteady, barely there. Alexander released a breath he seemed to have been holding for hours. His shoulders sagged. His head dropped forward. Then they were both crying, exhausted tears that had nothing to do with sadness and everything to do with relief so profound it hurt. Henry slept peacefully for the first time in hours, his breathing deeper, his color less alarming. The fever had broken. He would live. Alexander reached across the small space between them and took Daisy's hand. His grip was firm, warm, real. "Thank you," he said. "Anyone would have." "No," his voice was certain. "They wouldn't have." She wanted to argue, to deflect, to retreat behind the walls she'd built so carefully over the past 14 months. But his hand was still holding hers, and his eyes held something she couldn't quite name. And the dawn was breaking outside, and they'd fought death together and won. Something was changing between them, something that had started with rescue and grown through necessity into something more complicated. Neither was ready to name it. Neither was sure they wanted to. But it was there nonetheless, hanging in the air between them like smoke from the dying fire. They'd fought death together and won, but the victory felt intimate, in ways neither expected. The 2 weeks that followed Henry's fever saw their careful routine deepen into something more. Alexander was stronger now, his injuries healing, the headaches less frequent. He took over more of the baby care without being asked, changing cloths, warming milk, learning the specific ways each twin preferred to be held. Daisy watched him rock Edward to sleep one evening, humming a wordless melody that was probably something Margaret had sung, and felt something shift in her chest that she refused to examine. They shared domestic tasks with the ease of people who'd known each other far longer than 3 weeks. She cooked while he fed the boys. He fetched water while she kneaded bread. They moved around the small cottage in a dance of proximity and distance, catching each other's eyes across the room and looking away too quickly, as if prolonged contact might reveal something neither was ready to acknowledge. In the evenings by the fire, with the boys asleep and the night pressing close around them, they talked. He asked about her life before James, growing up in service to Lord Mackenzie, learning to read from the housekeeper's daughter, marrying young and foolishly to a man whose charm had hidden his demons. She asked about growing up as heir to a dukedom, tutors and expectations, learning to carry responsibility before he could carry his own weight, the pressure of a title that demanded perfection. Walls lowered, inch by careful inch, which made the betrayal hit harder. It was afternoon when Daisy went to the barn for eggs. She found Alexander there, standing near Bess's stall, folding a letter with quick, furtive movements. Ink stained his fingers. Guilt was written across his face as clearly as the words on that paper. "What's that?" she asked. The pause was too long. Far too long. "A message." Ice ran down her spine. "You sent a letter? From here?" Daisy, are you mad? Her fury came hot and immediate, born of fear she couldn't quite name. Do you understand what you've done? I had no choice. You had every choice. Her voice shook with anger and something deeper, betrayal, raw and cutting. You could have told me, asked me, this is my home, my life you're gambling with. If anyone traces that letter back here, they won't. He stepped toward her, hands raised in placation. I paid a traveling tinker in silver. He doesn't know who I am. He'll post it from Kingscott, 30 miles away. And if your cousin has men watching the posts? She heard her voice rising, couldn't stop it. If Edmund has people looking for any communication, any sign you're alive, then I already put you in danger by being here. His voice was quiet, steady. At least this way we might get proof, evidence I can use. Use for what? To destroy Edmund before he destroys us. Us. The word hung in the air between them like smoke, heavy with implications neither had voiced aloud. Daisy wanted to throw him out, wanted to tell him to take his boys and his dangerous secrets and his letters that could get them all killed and leave. But then Edward gurgled from his basket in the cottage doorway where she'd set him in the sun, and Alexander's face softened looking at his sons. And she recognized that expression because she'd felt it on her own face 100 times feeding them, holding them, watching them sleep. If this goes wrong, she said, her voice cold and controlled now, you take your boys and you run. You don't sacrifice me for your nobility. You don't make me a martyr for your cause. I would never. Promise me. His jaw worked. I promise. They both knew it was a lie, but sometimes lies were necessary for survival, and sometimes the truth was too heavy to carry. That night, Daisy barely slept. She lay in her narrow bed, the one she'd shared with James, the one she'd claimed back as her own after he died, listening to Alexander move near the hearth. He slept on the floor now, with the boys in their box beside him, close enough to hear if they woke, but far enough to give her the privacy she'd insisted upon. The distance felt both necessary and wrong. Her mind ran through everything that could go wrong. The letter intercepted. Men arriving in the dark with weapons and no mercy. Blood on her floors. Violence in her sanctuary. Death claiming what she'd worked so hard to save. She thought about leaving. Her father still lived in the village, such as it was, 3 miles if the roads were passable, which they weren't yet, but would be soon. She could go to him, tell him she'd been sick, needed care. Let Alexander and his dangerous nobility and his assassin-hunted sons become someone else's problem. But then she thought of Edward's toothless smile, of Henry's fierce grip on her finger, of the way they'd both started turning their heads when they heard her voice, recognizing her as someone safe, someone who belonged to them as much as they were starting to belong to her. She couldn't abandon them. Daisy pressed her hands together under the threadbare blanket, the first prayer she'd attempted since James died. She'd stopped believing God listened after watching her husband drink himself to death, despite her begging, her pleading, her prayers offered up like sacrifices that went unacknowledged. But tonight she prayed anyway. Prayed the letter arrive safely. Prayed that proof existed somewhere, written in ink and sealed with wax, that would name Edmund Carrington as the monster he was. Prayed it all ended without blood, without loss, without the world crashing down around them one more time. Across the room, she heard Alexander shift, heard him murmur something in his sleep that might have been Margaret's name, or might have been nothing at all. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. Inside, 2 babies slept peacefully, unaware of the danger circling them like wolves around a campfire. And Daisy lay awake, staring at the dark ceiling, realizing the most dangerous thing wasn't the assassins who might come, or the letter that might be traced, or the conspiracy that might consume them all. It was how much she'd come to care for all three of them. 5 weeks passed with the slow, agonizing pace of water dripping on stone. No word, no letter, no sign that Alexander's gamble had been anything but foolish hope sent out into a void that wouldn't answer. He grew tense as the days stretched on, pacing when the babies slept, wearing a path in the rough wooden floor between the hearth and the window. Daisy pretended everything was normal, cooked porridge, changed cloths, sang lullabies, while watching him deteriorate into restless energy that had nowhere to go. She went to the village once for supplies, inventing a story about cousins orphaned in a fire up north, come to stay until arrangements could be made. The neighbors were sympathetic, not suspicious. Mrs. Henderson brought a basket of preserves. Old Mr. Talbot offered his condolences with the awkward sincerity of a man unused to tragedy touching his doorstep. Daisy accepted their kindness with gratitude that tasted like ash and returned to the cottage with relief so profound she nearly wept. Domestic life continued its rhythm, feeding, changing, singing, surviving. But the moments of domesticity were starting to feel too natural. She found Alexander teaching Edward to grasp a wooden rattle one afternoon, his large hands patient as he guided tiny fingers around the handle, his face lighting up when Edward finally held it for 3 whole seconds. She discovered him asleep in the chair another evening, both boys sprawled across his chest like they belonged there, their small bodies rising and falling with his breathing. Her heart clenched at the sight, a physical pain she hadn't expected and couldn't quite name. He watched her bake bread with flour, dusting her hair, and her sleeves rolled up, something content settling across his features that made her look away before he could see her noticing. Small touches became inevitable in the confined space, passing a baby between them, hands brushing. Their conversations grew longer, deeper, stretching into the night long after propriety suggested they should retire to separate corners. They laughed together when Henry spit up spectacularly on Alexander's last clean shirt. The sound bright and real in a way laughter hadn't been for either of them in longer than they could remember. One evening, sitting by the fire after the boys finally slept, the quiet grew dangerous. The proximity grew dangerous. Alexander reached for her hand and she didn't pull away, and for one breathless moment his face moved closer and she could see the question in his eyes. Edward's cry split the silence. They jerked apart like guilty children, both grateful and disappointed for the interruption, neither willing to acknowledge what had almost happened. 5 weeks exactly since the letter was sent, violent knocking shattered the midnight silence. Daisy woke with her heart in her throat, terror flooding her system before consciousness fully returned. Alexander was already on his feet, moving toward the door with a knife in his hand. Where had he gotten a knife? She hadn't seen him carrying one. "Stay with the children," he said quietly. She didn't argue. Crossed the room in her nightdress, lifting Edward and Henry from their box with hands that wanted to shake but wouldn't let themselves. Retreated to the bedroom, pressed herself behind the door with both boys clutched to her chest. Her breathing came shallow and fast. The baby stirred, sensing her fear, but mercifully didn't cry yet. She heard Alexander at the door. "Who is it?" "Looking for Henry Barlow." A young voice, breathless. "Got a letter from Edinburgh." The pause stretched for 3 heartbeats. Then, "I'm Barlow." The door opened. Daisy pressed closer to the wall, straining to hear over her own heartbeat. "Letter for you, sir?" The young man sounded exhausted, soaked through if the dripping she could hear was any indication. You asked me to wait for a reply and deliver it personally. I came soon as it was placed in my hands. You rode through the night? Aye, sir. You paid well enough for speed. The sound of paper changing hands. Then Alexander's voice, rougher now. Here, take this. Sir, that's far more than we agreed. You were never here. You didn't see me. You understand? A pause. Then the clink of metal. Another gold cufflink probably, or whatever other valuables Alexander had left from his former life. I understand, sir. Saw nothing. Footsteps retreating. The door closing. The lock sliding home with a sound like finality. Only then did Daisy emerge from the bedroom, both babies still in her arms. Alexander stood at the door, envelope in hand, staring at it like it might bite him. What is it? She asked. The reply. He moved to the table, lit a candle with hands that shook slightly, broke the seal, read. The color drained from his face like water from a broken jug. He read again, as if his mind refused to accept what his eyes were seeing. Then he crushed the paper in his fist. He has proof, he said. Daisy set the babies back in their box with exaggerated care, buying time to steady herself before turning back to him. What kind of proof? Alexander's voice came low and hard. My solicitor didn't answer right away. First, he went where I couldn't. Used his name, his connections. Asked questions I couldn't ask without drawing attention. He unfolded the letter again, smoothed it on the table. He followed the money. Payments made under false names to men of a certain reputation. He found the men who attacked the carriage. 2 fled immediately, disappeared like smoke. But the third, a bitter smile. The third was too drunk to keep his mouth shut. Through him, my solicitor reached the others. 3 witnesses, all pointing to Edmund. Documents signed by intermediaries tied to my cousin. Payment records, dates, places. Everything matches the day of the attack. His eyes closed. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a robbery. It was planned murder. Cold spread through Daisy like frost across a window pane. So now you know. Now I know. And Edmund knows someone's looking where they shouldn't. I can't wait. If I stay still, I become a target again, a stationary target. Her breath caught. What will you do? Alexander set the letter down carefully, as if it might shatter. I have to go to Edinburgh, personally. Place this in the hands of someone Edmund can't touch. Who? He hesitated, then. The Duke of Wellington. Her eyes widened. The name was too large for this small kitchen, too powerful for a widow's cottage in Perthshire. Everyone knew Wellington, the Iron Duke, the man who defeated Napoleon, who moved in circles so far above common people they might as well be stars. My father served under him, Alexander explained. Pulled him from crossfire once at Waterloo. Wellington never forgot. If I reach him, I don't need him to hide me. I need him to open the right door, a magistrate, a minister, someone who'll ensure this letter doesn't vanish. Somewhere my cousin can't buy silence. Then the crown looks with clean eyes, and Edmund falls. When? The word came out smaller than she'd intended. He glanced toward the window, where the sky was just beginning to pale. First light. Daisy's chest caved. She forced herself to ask the question she already knew the answer to. And the children? The silence stretched long. His fear was visible in every line of his body, in the way his hands flexed at his sides, in the careful blankness he was trying to maintain on his face. That's when Daisy understood. He was about to ask her to keep them, and she was terrified she'd say yes. Alexander couldn't meet her eyes. "I can't take them," he said, the words coming rough and low. "The roads, if Edmund's men are still out there. You want to leave them here. I'm begging you." His voice broke on the last word. "I'll come back. 3 weeks at most. But I can't risk them. Daisy, I can't watch them die." She looked down at Edward and Henry in her arms. 8 months old now, stronger than the terrified infants she'd pulled from the river. They recognized her voice, her face, reached for her when they were frightened, smiled when she sang. She should say no, should send them all away, reclaim her solitude, protect herself from the inevitable heartbreak of caring too much. Instead, 3 weeks, not a day more. Alexander crossed the room in 2 strides and kissed her forehead, quick, desperate, trying for brotherly and failing completely. "Thank you," he whispered against her skin. "Thank you." He gathered his things, the dry coat she'd mended, boots worn but serviceable, a bag containing the little he owned in this world. At the door, he paused and looked back. Daisy stood in the center of the room with both babies in her arms, candles lighting her in gold, and something passed across his face that she couldn't quite read. "Take care of them," he said. "I will." He was gone before sunrise broke fully over the hills. Daisy stood on the porch with the babies in her arms, watching him ride down the hill on the horse he'd recovered from a farmer's field 2 weeks prior. He looked back once, only once, and even from a distance she felt the weight of that glance. Then he disappeared around the bend and was swallowed by the gray morning mist. She stayed long after he was gone, until Edward began to fuss, and Henry's small face crumpled with cold. Only then did she go inside and begin the routine without him. The first week was an adjustment written in sleepless nights and constant crying. The babies felt their father's absence like a physical wound. They woke searching for him, small hands reaching for empty air. They cried more, slept less, refused to be comforted by anything Daisy tried. She spent entire nights awake, holding them both, humming the wordless tunes Alexander used to hum until her voice went hoarse. Slowly, painfully, they adjusted. So did she. She began thinking of them as my boys, not just in her head now, but aloud, testing the words when no one could hear. She told them made-up stories about knights and dragons while she changed their cloths, sang songs her mother had taught her a lifetime ago, laughed when Edward tried to crawl and toppled over with indignant surprise written across his small face. The second week felt like wading underwater, everything muffled and strange and endless. 3 weeks seemed impossible. Each day stretched longer than the last. She went to the village for supplies, careful with her story, cousins orphaned in a fire, temporary care until arrangements could be made. Her father asked if she was all right alone out there. She said yes with the firmness she'd learned from grief, from surviving James, from pulling herself together when the world tried to break her. She didn't mention Alexander, didn't mention the baby's true origin, didn't mention any of it. Back at the cottage, she took inventory of her pantry, still holding, but barely. She made do, stretched every resource, reminded herself she'd survived on less before. The third week arrived like a deadline carved in stone. 3 weeks exactly since Alexander left, and the road remained empty. Daisy watched from the window whenever the baby slept, waiting for the sight of a rider cresting the hill. Nothing came. She tried not to imagine the worst: Alexander killed by Edmund's men, arrested for conspiracy, her cousin winning through violence or cunning. But at night, when the babies finally slept and she lay alone in her narrow bed, she cried quietly into her pillow. She cried for the unfairness of saving a man only to lose him, for growing attached to children who weren't hers to keep, for letting herself feel again when she'd promised herself never to. The fourth week brought a hollow acceptance. He wasn't coming back. Something had gone wrong. Death or prison, or simply running as far from danger as horses could carry him. Edward and Henry were hers now. Wrong names in her head, but the right feeling in her chest. She began thinking practically about how to explain them to her father, to the neighbors, how to raise two babies alone with almost nothing. But also, and this mattered more than she wanted to admit, they were hers now, and that changed everything. One afternoon, feeding the boys their warmed milk, she let herself cry openly. Edward looked up with solemn dark eyes and touched her cheek, curious about the tears. She took his tiny hand and kissed it. "We'll be all right," she whispered, "all three of us." The fifth week brought fear back and sharp focus. She was walking through the village when she saw two riders near the fallen fence, speaking with Mr. Talbot. One of them looked toward her too long, not casual interest, but assessment. Ice flooded her veins. She lowered her face, tightened her shawl, walked past as if she'd noticed nothing. But her hands shook all the way home. She locked the door with trembling fingers, understanding suddenly that no one would look here had always been hope, not certainty. She checked the old shotgun, made sure it was loaded, slept that night with it beside her bed. Every sound made her jump. The wind, a branch against the window, Bess shifting in the barn. By the sixth week, she'd stopped counting days. A dull ache had lodged itself in her chest. It wasn't just the burden of raising babies alone or the necessity of inventing stories for her father. It was losing him, Alexander. Somewhere between Henry's fever and the midnight letters and the quiet confessions by firelight, she'd begun feeling something beyond gratitude or necessity, something dangerous that she'd tried not to name. And now he was gone. And she was alone again with two babies who weren't hers, and a heart that ached in ways she didn't fully understand. 7 weeks to the day, on a cold morning while feeding the boys their breakfast, she let herself cry quietly. For the unfairness of it all, for saving a man only to lose him, for growing attached to children who would have been taken from her anyway, for letting herself feel again when she'd sworn she never would. Edward looked up at her with dark eyes, so like Alexander's, and reached a small hand toward her face, touching where tears fell. She took his tiny hand and kissed it. "We'll be all right," she whispered, trying to believe it. "All three of us. We will." Then, hoofbeats. Her heart stopped. Then it started racing, because she recognized that sound, and against all hope, all reason, she knew who it was. She stood frozen at the window, watching the single rider dismount. She recognized his posture before she could see his face, the way he moved, the set of his shoulders, the careful precision even in exhaustion. Alexander. Relief hit so hard she had to grip the window frame to stay upright. Alive, whole, here. She wasn't thinking when she ran. Didn't care about the cold mud under her bare feet or the impropriety of what she was doing. She just moved, down the porch steps, across the yard. He dismounted before she reached him. Daisy threw herself into his arms without thought for decorum or distance or anything except the fact that he was real and solid and here. He caught her, held her tight, pressed her against his chest. She felt his heart racing, felt his hands in her hair, felt everything she'd been holding back for 7 weeks threatening to spill over. "You're here," she said, voice breaking. "You're here. I'm here. I'm all right." They stayed like that for a long moment. She breathed him in, hoarse and road and sweat, but underneath it all, alive. Finally she pulled back, wiping her eyes quickly, embarrassed by the tears. "It took too long," she said. I know." His throat worked. "I'm sorry." "Did you do it?" A smile crossed his face, tired and relieved and victorious all at once. "I did, not quietly." Wellington had opened the right door, and when it opened, all of London heard. Edmund exposed. The payments, the witnesses, the conspiracy laid bare. There had been trials, depositions, Edmund fighting every step. It had taken 7 weeks instead of 3. "But it's done," Alexander said. "He's in prison awaiting execution." Daisy's legs nearly gave with relief. "Thank God. And now I can go home, to Gloucester, with my sons." Her heart sank sharp and immediate. Of course he would take them. It had always been obvious, always been the truth she'd been trying not to face. "They're well," she heard herself say. Groan. "Edward's crawling now. Henry laughs when I make faces." Alexander looked toward the house, love and anxiety written across his features. "May I see them?" "Yes, of course." Inside, the babies were still asleep in the larger box Daisy had cobbled together when they'd outgrown the first. They lay curled close as always, Edward's small hand resting on Henry's chest. Alexander stopped in the doorway, simply staring at his children, whom he hadn't seen in 7 weeks. Then he knelt beside the box and reached out, touching Edward's hair, then Henry's. They stirred, woke slowly, opening eyes to see their father's face. Henry made a small, wavering sound. Alexander lifted them both, gathering them to his chest. "I missed you," he whispered. "I missed you so much." Daisy turned away, pretending to straighten something on the table. She didn't want him seeing the tears, didn't want him knowing how much it hurt. The following days held too much silence and too few words. Alexander stayed, at first because he needed to rest, then because he didn't seem to know how to leave again. The house held 2 adults once more, but they didn't return to the rhythm from before. Something had changed in the space of his absence, a shift too fundamental to ignore. He spoke of London, solicitors demanding signatures, estates requiring urgent repairs, accounts needing attention. He mentioned servants to hire, lands to reorganize, responsibilities that had accumulated in his absence. He spoke like a duke again, not like the man who'd learned to warm milk and change cloths and sing lullabies in the dark. Daisy listened in silence, keeping to her routine, preparing meals, tending babies, maintaining normalcy. But she felt the distance that wasn't physical, the space growing between what they'd been and what they'd become. One bright afternoon, Alexander sat on the porch with Henry, speaking distractedly, not hearing the weight of his own words. "I'll need to hire a nurse," he said. "Someone experienced. Gloucester is large and the boys will need constant care while I handle estate business." Daisy stood in the kitchen, hands in cold water, scrubbing dishes. She stopped. "A nurse." "Of course." Sensible. Expected. Dukes didn't raise their own children alone. There were people for that. She said nothing, just went back to scrubbing, movements automatic. Alexander continued, still not noticing. "And a tutor later. Latin, mathematics, everything expected of heirs." He didn't notice her silence until Henry shifted and she didn't appear, as she always had, to take the baby, to smile, to lighten the moment. His sentence died. He faltered. Daisy? She appeared in the doorway, hands still wet, face steady, eyes distant. Understanding hit him with cruel delay. London had returned to him the old discipline, the one that taught him to speak of grand things so he wouldn't have to speak of what hurt. I wasn't replacing you, he said, voice rough now, stripped. I was trying to make sure nothing takes them from us again. I did it the way I was trained to, thinking in hires and rules and plans. Daisy didn't answer, but he saw the damage in the way she didn't move, in the silence that wasn't defiance but retreat. Behind the firmness of her face, he recognized something that struck deeper than accusation. Fear of becoming temporary, useful, easily replaced. She dried her hands slowly, as if she needed to finish that one small act before accepting what she already knew. Then she walked to the window, looking out at the pasture stretching too peacefully beyond. She could see Alexander still rocking Henry, pointing towards something on the horizon, explaining something the baby would never understand. Henry laughed, enchanted by voice and motion and the safety of his father's embrace. Daisy understood, not with anger or bitterness, but with cold, final clarity, that everything they'd lived here had been an interval, a parenthesis opened by necessity, held by danger, closed when order returned. Alexander was stepping back into his world. His world had rules, titles, structures, places designed for everything except her. When he returned fully to Gloucester, to the space that was always his by right, there would be no place for Daisy Bentley. There would be nurses and tutors and servants and all the decorum that came with a duke's household. She would become a story told afterward. Nothing more. She set the cloth down, not in haste, not in drama, and crossed the house in silence, slipped out the back door, walked through the pasture to the still fallen fence where the river Tay ran calm now, contained, obedient, as if it had never threatened to destroy everything. She rested her hands on the cold wood and drew a deep breath. She thought of her life before Alexander arrived, lonely, hard, but hers. She'd survived her husband's death, survived alone on this land without help or promises. She'd been strong enough for that. She would be strong again. The cold air filled her lungs, sharp and clarifying. She wouldn't ask to stay, wouldn't beg for a place in anyone's life, wouldn't make herself smaller to remain needed. If Alexander left with his sons, she would endure. With that certainty, hard, silent, complete, she turned back toward the house. She'd survived worse. She'd survive this too, even if surviving meant losing the only family she'd found since James died. Before we reach the end of this journey, I must ask you something. These stories take countless hours to craft, to research, to bring to life for you. If Daisy's courage, her impossible love, her choice has moved you even a little, please hit like and subscribe. It costs you nothing but means everything to this channel. Help these tales reach others who need them. Now let's see how Daisy's story ends. Before he said anything, Daisy saw it. Alexander near the hearth, Edward sprawled across his chest, Henry propped against his arm. He was doing nothing remarkable, just laughing softly when one boy tugged at a shirt button, an unguarded, genuine laugh of the kind that could not be rehearsed. He looked home. Not a visitor, not a guest, but someone who belonged to this space as fully as she did. The sight struck her without warning, not because it was rare, but because it no longer was. Her chest tightened. She looked away too quickly. like someone caught wanting what they shouldn't. This was exactly the kind of image she needed to erase before he left, the kind of memory that would make goodbye unbearable. She began tidying, keeping her hands busy, because if she stayed still, if she allowed herself to watch even a few seconds more, everything she'd been building inside, that careful acceptance of loss, would collapse before it was ever tested. She was ready to lose them. She had to be. Then he said her name. Daisy. She stopped. The way he said it, low, steady, weighted with intent, cut deeper than it should. It broke the fragile normalcy she was trying to hold together. She drew a breath, wiped her face quickly as if she could erase any trace of what she felt, squared her shoulders, preparing to hear the expected farewells, plans, practical explanations. Look at me. She turned slowly. Alexander was on his feet now, Edward and Henry in his arms, both pressed against his chest, safe and content. That image, so simple, so impossible, made something contract inside her. He looked at her with an intensity that didn't match the calm of his voice. No rush, no anxiety, just decision. Come with me. She blinked, confused. For a moment she thought she'd misheard. What? To Gloucester. He drew a breath, as if finally speaking something he'd held back for weeks. Not as a favor, not as charity, as a choice. Her heart pounded too hard. She shook her head almost on instinct. I can't. Why not? The words came before she could soften them. Because this isn't my world. Because you're a duke and I'm just a farmer's widow. Because it will swallow me whole. She expected him to argue quickly, to soften it, to promise it would be easy. Instead, Alexander watched her in silence for a moment. Then he spoke, calm, firm, without romance. For 7 weeks, everyone told me what I should do, which political alliances to form, which marriages would be convenient, which name would best protect the title. A tired half-smile. And in every one of those conversations, I thought of you, of this house, of my sons sleeping safely here, of who was with them when I wasn't. Her chest tightened. That's gratitude. She murmured it more to shield herself than from conviction. He shook his head. No, gratitude fades. What I felt when I imagined you here alone, that didn't fade for a single day. She looked away. Even if I felt something, her voice faltered, it wouldn't change anything. It changes everything. He moved closer, careful to respect her space but unwilling to retreat. Because I'm not asking you to fit into my world, Daisy. I'm asking you to come with me and change it. A weak laugh escaped her, almost a sob. And how do you imagine that? He hesitated only a second. The only way that makes sense. He drew a breath. Marry me, Daisy. Be the official mother of my sons. Be my wife. The silence that fell was heavy, dense, full of everything left unsaid. That's madness, she whispered. I don't know how to be a duchess. I wasn't raised for it. I know, a faint smile. And that's exactly why I need you. Tears came before she could stop them. They'll judge me. Not just me. You, the boys. They'll say I don't belong. That I'm a mistake you'll need to correct. There will be no correction. It will be a scandal. Her voice broke. For society, for your family, for them when they grow. He stepped closer. Let them talk. I carry this name now, and I take responsibility for everything that comes with it, including you." She closed her eyes, thought of James, of the river, of waiting, of babies in her arms, of the house she would leave behind, opened her eyes. The decision was already made. "Yes," she said softly. He released a breath as if he'd been holding it for months, stepped in, kissed her with care, not as someone who takes, but someone who promises. The babies cried. They laughed, pulling apart. Daisy took Edward. Alexander took Henry. There, in the middle of that small house, scented with wood and warm milk, something improbable was taking shape. Not a perfect tale, but a family. 6 months later, the wedding was a small ceremony that didn't try to persuade anyone. It simply happened, simply existed. Daisy's father, his eyes bright as though he could finally breathe after so many funerals, led his daughter to Alexander. There were few guests, close family, men who'd survived London's intrigues. Gloucester's oldest servants gathered at a careful distance with curiosity held in check. And of course, Edward and Henry. The boys cried through much of the ceremony, deeply offended by the notion that anyone might speak so long without offering to hold them. Alexander took them at one point, Daisy at another. The exchange was seamless, as if it were the most natural thing. Daisy wore a simple gown of fine linen, cream-colored, without excessive lace or showy jewels. Nothing that shouted Duchess. Everything that said Daisy. Alexander murmured that she was perfect. She didn't quite believe him, but she stored the words where one keeps things that warm. Gloucester was different when they returned. Alexander had invested part of his inheritance in restoring the estate, like a man rebuilding a body after long fever. The great house had been repaired with care, bright walls, sound roof, windows that no longer let wind cut through like a blade. Gardens were coming back to life slowly, as if someone had apologized to the land. Staff were paid on time, treated with firm fairness. The house breathed order. The early days, Daisy felt lost. Too many corridors, too many doors, too many rules and expectations that no one voiced aloud but lingered in every glance. Servants appeared and vanished with practiced efficiency. At times she felt like she was standing in a space not made for her, a world expecting her to notice and retreat on her own. But little by little, she found her place. She cared for the boys herself, to the discomfort of older maids, managed the household with attention and fairness, made mistakes, learned, asked when she didn't know. Alexander was always beside her, unhurried, without public corrections, without the kind of protection that humiliates, just presence. The first formal dinner nearly made her step back. She stood before the mirror, studying the green silk gown the dressmaker had prepared, barely recognizing herself. She looked like someone wearing a life that didn't belong to her, as if the fabric were meant for another woman, one who knew where to place her hands, when to smile, when to stay silent. Alexander appeared behind her in the reflection, calmly adjusting his tie. "You look beautiful." "I look out of place." "You look exactly where you belong." The dinner wasn't perfect. She confused titles, laughed too loudly when other women only curved their lips, used the wrong fork more than once. Still, for a few moments, she almost allowed herself to believe she might survive without losing herself. Then Lady Catherine spoke. They sat at a table far too long, beneath chandeliers far too heavy, glasses gleaming like watchful eyes. Lady Catherine possessed the sharp elegance of someone who'd never needed permission to exist. She studied Daisy's hands, the short nails, the traces of labor no ring could erase. "It is unusual," she said lightly. "A duchess who prefers to smell of milk and firewood." Silence fell with the precision of a blade. Some pretended to drink. Others pretended not to have heard. Alexander went utterly still across the table, his gaze darkening. Daisy set her napkin down calmly. She looked at Lady Catherine without haste, without tremor, the way one looks at a storm when there's nowhere left to hide. "I prefer to smell of a living home," she said quietly, "and so do my children." The silence that followed was different. Not merely embarrassment, but decision, hierarchy being redrawn in front of them all. Alexander didn't smile. He didn't need to. He only raised his glass as if sealing something without speech. That night was the first time Daisy felt, not that she belonged to that world, but that the world was beginning to learn how to make room for her. Edward and Henry grew, learning to walk, then speak. They called Daisy mother without anyone teaching them the word. She cried the first time, a brief, embarrassed cry she tried to hide by turning away. Alexander wrapped his arms around her from behind, laughing and moved, kissing her temple as though that were a crown truer than any jewel. The seasons passed. She learned to move within society. She was still too direct for some, still awkward in certain drawing rooms. Some whispered she was improper. Others tried to ignore her with studied coldness. But little by little, she earned respect, not because of her title, but because of her presence, her fairness, the way no one around her felt diminished so she might appear greater. Alexander loved her in a steady, unshowy way. She felt it in small things. Coffee prepared the way she liked, the way he watched her read to the boys, as if that sound were music that repaired the whole house. Her laughter echoing through Gloucester's halls, where laughter had never lived before. One cold winter night after putting the children to bed, Alexander took her hand. The fire crackled softly, wind striking the windows without managing to enter. "You know what I think sometimes?" he asked. "What?" "That the flood changed everything." She turned to him, her face lit by fire. "You almost died. But I found you." She touched his face with her fingertips, as if still confirming he was there. "I think of it too. If the rain hadn't come, if the bridge hadn't fallen. But it did, and it brought us here." He kissed her slowly. Outside, rain began to fall, not violent like that autumn storm, but steady, as if the sky were repeating an old story in a low voice. She listened to the sound of water on the roof. Thought of that first night, the swollen river, the trapped carriage, the wounded man, the crying babies. Thought of the mud and cold and fear that had followed like a shadow. She realized she was no longer afraid of rain. Not now, because when storms came, she wouldn't be alone. She would have Alexander, Edward, Henry. She would have family. He pulled her closer, his voice coming like a simple promise without spectacle. "I love you." She closed her eyes, settled against him, feeling warmth no title could buy. "I love you too." Outside the rain kept falling, but inside that house, they were safe, together, home. Years later, when Edward and Henry were old enough to ask, Daisy told them the truth. "I pulled you from the river, and you pulled me back to life."